How's it going, everybody? Rice Bonds, Montana to Young here, and I wanted to try something a little bit new on my channel since I've been trying to grow it a little bit more. I would like to be able to engage more people directly using this format on YouTube. I think I've seen other folks use it to great effect to enhance their enjoyment of the hobby and to enhance the interactions that you have with other folks who also enjoy collecting cards. So I have a couple of topics that are swimming around my head. I figured I would just broach one of them today. It's one of my favorite topics of all time to talk about. I've been on the Essential Credentials podcast before talking about this stuff, and it's really 1990s baseball inserts, parallels, inserts, rare cards from the 90s, particularly from the mid to late 90s, is my favorite type of card to collect. And as my handle may suggest or reputation may precede, I am a huge Barry Bonds collector. So the marriage of 90s cards and Barry Bonds is a marriage made in heaven, especially for a collector like me. I guess before I get into the topic of today, I would want to ask anyone who's watching what percentage you would consider yourself a collector, and then what percentage you would consider yourself an investor. I've given it some thought. I think it changes over time, and it also depends on the genre of card you're talking about, the player, the set. But let's just go with your main personal collection. Whether you collect a team, a set, a player, whatever it is you collect, what would you say is the percentage of investor in your DNA, and what percentage of it is collector, is pure collector? And before we get any further, I think we all know what the attitudes are of those two types of collectors. Collectors who've been around a while disdain investors, and investors kind of don't understand why collectors are so old-fashioned and crotchety. I actually think that most collectors that I know are an amalgamation, a mixture of both. I have a hard time believing that people don't care about the value of their cards in a money sense. I just don't believe that some of these cards would be as appealing to a lot of us if they didn't hold some value to all of us. So I find that a little bit hard to believe. Maybe it's just because there's a little bit more investor in my DNA than there is in most of the people that I talk to about collecting. But I really think that the dislike for investors by collectors and vice versa is kind of maybe a misunderstanding, and maybe even sort of an insecurity, just because if you collect baseball cards in the 90s like I did and a lot of my friends did, then you followed the up and down arrows of the Beckett magazine. I mean, it really mattered to you whether that number was going up or down in the magazine. When you took your card to the local card shop in the 90s, first of all, everything was in a card saver for me and no penny sleeve, because who was going to spend money on supplies when you could spend it on a pack of cards? But you would take it to the LCS and they would pay you the Beckett low price for anything, because they knew that they could sell that card back for the Beckett high price. And we weren't really investing back in the 90s, but we were told by people who knew the previous generations of cards that some of these cards could be worth fantastic amounts of money someday. And that was, I'm sure, heavily influenced by the fact that cards from the 50s and 60s and 40s in particular had, within the last 10 or 20 years, shot up in value tremendously, just exponentially. So when my dad first introduced me to card collecting, baseball card collecting, he drew from his experience collecting in Taiwan. He collected these animal cards, kind of like Allen and Ginter's early sets where there are wildlife and plants and stuff. And so he also was a fan of baseball, the San Francisco Giants, and he got me into cards. And ever since then, I've enjoyed it, and I don't think that just because, even if my investor side took over my personality or took over my objectives and motives in card collecting, there's no way you could wipe clean from your DNA, the collector part of you. I just don't think that anybody could stay in this hobby for very long if they didn't actually love some aspect of the hobby. And I don't think all of us need to love the same part of the hobby. Some people like to flip cards. That's not my cup of tea. But if I'm honest with myself, when I collected hockey cards in the late 2010s, right around that era, one of my big goals as a hockey card collector was to trade up. That just meant that I would take two cards of lesser value and combine them together to buy or trade for a card that was less than the two of those put together, but obviously more valuable than either of those two cards individually. So that was part of collecting for me back then, largely because I was a San Jose Sharks fan, and there aren't that many superstars that are in the inner circle of the Hall of Fame, other than maybe Joe Thornton, who you could really collect. And of course, the organization has never won a championship. So I think you really grow to have a connection with your team when your team wins a championship, like the San Francisco 49ers or the Giants, for example. So coming back from my diversion, I would say that in terms of percentage, I am 60 to 70% a collector and 30 to 40% an investor. And I feel like those labels are really clunky, really general, really broad. They paint with too broad a brush. They don't really take into account the intricacies and the things that make everybody different and unique about the way they approach cards. So maybe it's also because I'm a little bit worried about my flank, where people would say, hey, you're more about, the cash money than you about the cards themselves. And really, I mean, when you really start breaking it down, I feel like those two things, they start to blend into each other a little bit. There are some people, of course, out there who are purely investors, and that's on one side of the scale. Those people, I think, are relatively rare, but there are people who don't like cards at all. I mean, cards for them is just a vehicle to have more money. But I mean, if that's what they like to do, it really doesn't bother me that much. Obviously, because I don't really think it affects me that much. I know that those people were blamed largely for dragging the market up, but I just don't buy that theory. I think that if people didn't really enjoy dealing in cards and being around sports cards more than just using them as a asset class or whatever they call it these days, I don't think they would have stayed with it and helped propel the market to the heights that it was at earlier this year in 2021, the first quarter. So I just don't think there are that many of them, but they do exist. And then on the other hand, I'm sure there are collectors out there who literally give zero concern to how much their collection is worth. Usually those collections are relatively worthless in terms of the monies and dollars and cents kind of way, but they love the cards and they don't really care how much they spend on it and how much it's going to be someday. They don't care whether they're going to be passing down a valuable collection to their children or their grandkids or something like that. They purely love the card and they couldn't care less about the value. But I've actually met maybe one in my entire life of that type of collector. I just don't think that's very common. I don't think that collecting physical objects the way we do would make a lot of sense if those things themselves didn't have some kind of intrinsic value. I guess I've heard somebody put it before. Another YouTuber by the name Bill the Hall of Fame Collector, I believe, noted that I, in particular, maybe shouldn't be as concerned about the actual investment value of those cards. Maybe should be more concerned about the coolness of the cards themselves, which is a fair point. Because even though I'm 60-40, 70-30, maybe even 80-20, sometimes you can get off kilter, right? Sometimes you can get to the point where you're so into the collecting aspect that you forget to mind the dollars and cents aspect. You may overspend for a card just because you want that card so badly. It doesn't matter what it's worth to anybody else. It doesn't matter what it's going to be worth to people down the line. You just love it that much. You got to calibrate there, because we all have finite resources, and so you need to be careful. Just because you really, really desire a card, and money is no object when compared to that desire, you can definitely get off balance there. And on the other hand, if you see cards just as dollars and cents a little bit too much, and you tip the other direction, I think that it can strip the joy away. The joy that almost everybody in the hobby has for some aspect of card collecting. I mean, I'm lucky to be from the 1990s in a way. I know that we always were lamenting the fact that we grew up during the junk wax era, but now going back, I mean, it's kind of a blessing in disguise. A lot of our favorite players were in sets that are just worthless to a lot of people, and so they're easy to buy for ourselves. I've been going through kind of a phase right now of buying a lot of Barry Bonds base cards and common cards in really high grades because I've always been kind of a condition hawk, and I appreciate a good, crispy, clean, minty card. That's just looking at a card like that, regardless if it's a $1 card or a $10,000 card. It brings me a lot of satisfaction to see a card that's crispy clean. And on the other side of the same coin, it can drive me absolutely nuts if it's not clean. If there's some really prominent ding, or even a ding that's not prominent that I know about, that will bother me basically for the entire time that I own that card. So that was a huge diversion in terms of collector versus investor. And that actually may be better set as its own part, because part two of what I wanted to talk about today was really actually what I wanted to talk about most of all. And that is 1990s baseball cards and how good of an investment 1990s baseball cards are. I don't even know if investment is the right word. The way I saw baseball cards when I came back in 2018, it must have been, strictly to collect Barry Bonds. What was going on was that I had gone so many years not doing what I really wanted to do, which was to collect baseball cards, that I searched for all sorts of other things to occupy my time with, things like hockey cards or comic books or what have you. Even for a while there, I was reselling, DVD codes on eBay because it was fun. It's just another hobby to pass the time and unwind at the end of a long day. So when I came back, I thought, you know what? Here's an opportunity for me to put my money in objects that I want, regardless of how much they cost, and know that maybe down the road, I can sell it for just as much, if not more, than what I originally paid. That's a comforting feeling, because if you sink a lot of money into your hobby, ideally you'd be able to recover that money if you ever needed to. In a lot of cases, that's not the case, right? If you build hobby airplane models, for example, you buy that model in a box at a hobby store, take it home, glue it together, that thing is now priceless to you and worthless to everyone else. It's different from collecting stamps or coins or cards that, in modern times at least, have always had some currency to it. There's always been a price guide to these things. The price guide of these items have always been central to most of our collecting DNA. So I just think that talking about collecting cards as an investment for the time being, you have to take it with a grain of salt and understand what it is I was trying to say. So, I heard on another YouTube podcast that there's, short-term flippers, then there are short-term investors, people who hold for anywhere between 1 to 5 years, and then any year beyond the 5th year would be considered a long-term investor. And if you had to break everybody into that group, I obviously would be a long-term investor. I thought if I bought Barry Bonds cards, even if I later decided that I didn't have as much sentimental attachment to it, I wanted to make sure that I didn't lose a ton of money doing it, because these cards, they're not cheap. I could collect cheaper cards, that's always an option, but I decided not to. I decided to go for cards that I've always wanted, cards that I've always seen from afar, like the 1986 Topps Tiffany traded set. The bonds from that is the first bonds card I bought when I came back, and that's a huge card. That was a 4-figure card when it was in a slab in Gem Mint with PSA. So that was a huge jump from not having ever spent $50 or more on a single sports card. It was a huge leap to go from that to this, and I think it would be irresponsible given the income of most middle class people to spend $1,000 on a card if they didn't believe that that card would be worth as much, if not more, at the time. I mean, reasonable minds may disagree, right? You could go out and buy a model airplane set that cost $1,000. You bring it home, you have hundreds of hours of enjoyment, and you get to hang it from your ceiling every day and enjoy it. But that card is that plane is now worth $0. In fact, you probably have to pay somebody to come and pick it up and take it to the dumpster. So in that sense, yes, the hobby is too general a word, I think, to use for cards. I think it's fair to say that cards occupy a special place. They're a special type of hobby, like stamp collecting, like coin collecting, where part of the enjoyment of collecting is to try to get good bargains, is to try to find a card for less than the market will bear, so that you can either flip it to get a card you want even more, or you can hold it knowing that you can look at that card every day until the day you finally get tired of it. When you do, you can move it. So if that is the definition of investment, then my question to you all is, how good of an investment do you think 1990s baseball cards are? I just want to give you a couple of things to think about that's been swimming in my head. So one of the most prominent genres of cards when you go to a serious card show like the National, which skews a little bit older, a little bit more old school for sure, I would say that the largest amount of cards that you go, maybe barring this year, is going to be vintage by far, by a long shot. So I'm just thinking about the 2018 and 2019 Nationals. It was about at least 50%, if not 60% of the whole show was vintage cards. Just counting cards and not memorabilia and comic books. So amongst baseball cards, vintage is 50 to 60%. Then you have modern, which is probably another 30%. The Mike Trouts, the Fernando Tatis Jr., whatever the hot rookie card is of the day, that type of stuff is second most represented at shows. And then maybe the third most represented group is autographs. For some reason, I mean, it's not for some reason, it's for obvious reasons. Autographs are highly appealing to a lot of collectors. It has a lot of widespread appeal, a lot of mainstream appeal. People understand what it is. It's relatively easy to authenticate if you know what you're talking about. You can look up the sets that released pack-issued autographs and then make sure that the many images of those cards from that set that are online match what you're looking at. So it's much harder to get duped. It's still possible. There are some sets, like the Peter Max set, for example, where it's very easy to get duped. People will forge in any genre. But I think part of the reason autographs are so appealing is, one, they're so personal. Your favorite player touched that card in the case of hard signed autographs. And also, you know pretty much what you're getting. What you see is what you get. If it's an in-person autograph, you presumably have the eye to know well enough whether that's likely to be a legitimate autograph or not. So I think that's why it's the third most represented group. I would have assumed that in the early 2010s, memorabilia and relics were a huge part, but now they're so widely worthless in a lot of modern cases that I think it's fallen by the wayside. And they do exist, but usually you have it in combination with an autograph before anybody would want to pay attention to it. I don't know what else I'm missing. I mean, I'm sure I'm missing some other ones. Like vintage goes from all the way from the first cards ever made till maybe 1975, 1980, I don't know where the cutoff is. And then you have a bunch of people who collect 80s cards, people my age, who I grew up in 1980. I mean, I was born in 1980 and grew up in the 80s. So I enjoyed the players that came up during that era, and I have an affinity for 80s cards, especially since my favorite player, Barry Bonds, has all of his rookie and pre-rookie cards in 1987 and 1986. And those cards were the first cards I ever laid eyes on. And anyone who collects cards will tell you the first baseball card you've ever seen in your life, you remember what those cards look like. They were formative. Pretty much every collector I've ever talked to can tell me what the first set they ever saw of a baseball card was and how important a set it is to them. In my case, it was 1987 Topps. It was a Will Clark that I pulled from a rack pack. It was a rack pack that my mom bought for me at the mall when I was about 6 or 7 years old, living in the Silicon Valley. There was an old mill, an actual milling wheel that was powered by a waterfall that was indoors to this crazy mall that had all sorts of foliage. And, I was 6 years old, so I don't remember it that well, but I do remember the sort of the feeling and the, I don't know, the ambiance and the just sort of the feeling of the area. So I remember you looking at the cards at the first time, and so now when I look at 1987 Barry Bonds Tiffany and just the regular issue, and then also the O-Pee-Chee Parallel, or the set that was released in Canada, the partial parallel set released in Canada, those cards ring loud and true to me. They speak to me. I love them. I wasn't a Bonds collector back then, obviously. I didn't even know who he was as a 9-year-old San Francisco Giants fan. But now going back, instead of Will Clark being the main guy, now I go after Barry Bonds because he's my favorite player. Makes sense. So then my point is like you have to go about 7 or 8 levels down before you get to 1990s baseball inserts. That's such a niche market that I feel like if you've been collecting a while, or are familiar with most everybody who collects in the genre. They're more prominent now that there's proliferation of high-end 1990s basketball collectors. The first one who comes to mind is Nat Turner, the fabulously wealthy person who ended up being part of a consortium that bought PSA and then Golden Auctions. And he strikes me as a true collector, the way he talks about cards, the way he loves them. Just because he spends a lot on them doesn't discount how much of a true fan of the hobby he is. And I hope that he never takes his eye off the ball and never forgets what made the hobby so important to him when he begins to run PSA on a more sort of day-to-day basis since he's taken it over. So back to 1990s baseball inserts. Right now, it's interesting because all the energy for that era of cards has been sucked out of the room by basketball. My understanding is that basketball has always been a much more important thing in the 90s than baseball. I think possibly because baseball had a reputation of always being there. The strike in 1994 really damaged the sport and the hobby. And the ascendance of the greatest player in the history of basketball was in the 90s. It was Michael Jordan. So in the 90s, I think maybe all of the energy or much of the energy was in basketball cards. I wasn't there for that. I had left the hobby already by like 1994. But that's my guess. That's my understanding. And it's more so the case now with all these new folks that have come into the hobby. Basketball is still king. And even the fact that basketball is still king doesn't really move the needle that much for 1990s basketball cards. So if 1990s basketball cards is a niche market where there's only like 200 guys, the same ones who collect all the cards, then you can imagine how much smaller and modest the 1990s baseball insert market is. And it's true. Our biggest star in our genre is, without a doubt, Ken Griffey Jr. He has been the most popular player during his playing days, and then after a lull and retirement, I think he's since climbed to the very, very top of our genre. Anyone who's collected 90s cards in baseball for any period of time knows that Ken Griffey Jr. is king. And he is the closest approximation to what collecting basketball cards from the same set would be. Although, as pointed out by some very knowledgeable collectors, I mean, Ken Griffey Jr. would not even reach the top 20 highest selling basketball players, for example, in the 1990s. So it's hard to really say how much of a good investment it is. I actually never thought it was a very good investment. I've since been persuaded. I kind of go back and forth. I mean, I've spoken to one friend who made the good point that this is like how people collect base cards now from old sets where there aren't a lot of decent copies of those base cards that have survived. And so it's really scarce. And even just a plain old base card from 1948 Bowman or 1949 would be amazing, would be very valuable. Doesn't matter what the player is. And his point was that because the print run of a lot of these inserts that we collect are so low, they were artificially tamped down on. They're artificially scarce, which could be a good thing. It could be a bad thing. Point is there aren't very many copies of the cards that are most coveted by people who collect 1990s baseball card inserts. So he thinks that in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, even after we've long passed, people will look back and see some of the best inserts from the 90s as being the best possible cards you can acquire of a particular player during that era, because there's 10 million copies of each 1989 Upper Deck card. But by the time they made it to 1999, there were sets out there where the entire print run was 30 or 25, 10 even. So he could be right. I mean, this could be the vintage of the future, and it would share one other attribute with vintage, which is that it is an incredibly insular and sort of it's a niche market. You have to know exactly what you're doing, otherwise you're going to get taken. So I would say that there's a good chance it could do that, but just looking back on history, it's still the very top inner circle Hall of Fame players who garnered the most money from having just a regular base card from one of their seasons from a vintage set, like a 1957 Mantle or something, 1958 Mays, I don't know, a 1954 Hank Aaron. Not a rookie year, maybe close to their rookie year, maybe within a decade of their rookie year. Those cards are still valuable if it's a big name. So I've always felt that it's safe to collect the greatest of all time players in whatever sport. And say what you will about Barry Bonds, but I think that most people would agree that he was an incredible baseball player, one of the best the world has ever seen, regardless of the controversies that surround him and the reasons that people don't like him on a personal, visceral level. So I just think that this type of personal dislike is often stoked by the media, and often we are prisoners of the time. We can't really see beyond what is right in front of us. And what is right in front of us right now is that nobody cares about Barry Bonds. But I don't think that's going to be the case in the future. I think he's going to age very, very well. I think his records and accomplishments are going to age very, very well as we move through the next generation or two or three players that come up. And so, regardless of whether the 90s is a good investment, I feel like Barry Bonds is. So, and in terms of investments, the other side of it is most people would suggest that you collect rookie cards, parallels of rookie cards, or pre-rookie cards, XRCs, just because everybody knows what they are. There are only a handful of them, at least back in the 80s and beforehand. Now, I mean, it's difficult to know what's a true rookie card. In hockey, it's very, very clearly defined what a true rookie card is. It has to be a rookie card that is released in the base set of a normal set with numbers in the back that is released after the player has played a game in the NHL. And if it's not that, if it's a parallel, if it's a pre-rookie card, then even if it's, a very scarce parallel, like the high gloss out of 10 version of the famous Young Guns rookie cards in hockey, you still have way more energy around the true rookie cards. And so I think that does carry over to baseball before things got kind of out of control. I couldn't tell you now what the base autograph rookie card Pujols or Trout is worth compared to their much rarer counterparts. Because of the artificial rarity a lot of sports cards companies have introduced to their cards and their sets, it's changed the dynamic a little bit. And baseball card collectors are much more likely to value a rare parallel of a base rookie card than hockey. So, like a high-end Young Gun that's in pristine condition that has no business being in pristine condition because it is such an old set. Then compared to one of the high gloss or UD exclusives out of 100, and the prices are not as far off from each other as you would expect, because one card has been printed in the tens of thousands and the other card has been printed 10 times, and somehow yet it's actually pretty close or closer than you would imagine, just because true rookie cards are valued that highly. And so if I wanted to collect bonds and really tend to the 30% of my motivation that involves investment and making sound money choices when I buy a card, the smart thing to do, if history is any help, the smart thing to do would be collect rookie cards and pre-rookie cards. And so I do have a robust stable of cards from those key years for my particular player. And I think that investment-wise, it's easier for people who are coming into the hobby anew to sort of know, okay, there's only 1 year basically where a person can have their first card, first license card, or first rookie card, and everybody knows what those are. There's not a lot of confusion or controversy over what is a rookie card. So it's a lot lower barrier to entry. If you want a Ivan Rodriguez rookie card, there are a handful of them, and you can just go and get them. And a lot of them aren't very expensive at all, right? But you know what they are. Like, you don't have to do a lot of research. Whereas for vintage, for T206s, for example, for something as obscure and deep as 1990s inserts, you kind of have to be an expert in cards to even really know what the heck you're doing. An expert in 1990s inserts of your sport in order to kind of know what you're doing. So that's a huge barrier to entry. I think that that's likely to be the reason why 90s inserts remain kind of off on the side, something that almost nobody collects but the people that we know who collect it, which is a lot. But we also live in a bubble where we think a lot of people love 90s cards, when in actuality, it's just that everybody around us loves it. But the greater collecting population at large doesn't even know what it is. I've gone through, personally, a stage of collecting autographs pretty recently, high-end stuff, and I have found that it's easier to find autographs, even rare ones, than it is to find just a plain old numbered or unnumbered rare insert from the late 90s. Part of it is because I think autographs are more saleable, they're easily sold off and more easily authenticated, and people know exactly what they're getting. Whereas with 90s stuff, when it's just a plain insert, you really have to know your stuff. And if you don't, you're probably going to overpay, you're probably going to make a mistake that you're going to later regret. And nobody wants to be left holding the bag. So if you come into the hobby and you're green, you're not going to go for the most difficult genre. You're going to go for the easiest. Either do modern, where everybody's talking about it and all the energy is there and all the information is there, or, do something like just get a rookie card of your favorite player. Getting the 1999 Fleer Brilliance 24 karat of your player, or the Golden Anniversary Refractor out of 5 from 1998. the Bowman Chrome Golden Anniversary. Um, those are fantastic cards, but you really need to know what you're doing, right? I mean, because you go into a Bowman Chrome 1998, and there are a lot of cards that are printed with a fake serial number. So like if you didn't collect for like at least a year and know a whole bunch of other people who collected in your era, you wouldn't even know that. And if you do know that, that would scare you away. The fact that there are counterfeits out there, aftermarket releases, there are executive proofs, and all these other shady things that came from uncut sheaths that were later cut outside of the factory by a collector or a flipper who then sold it off piecemeal, pretending as if was a card that was pack released, because it doesn't matter what sport or genre you're talking about. Being pack released and not some other sort of aftermarket thing is very important to most collectors. So anyways, in sum, I think that it is more fun to collect 1990s cards than it is a good investment. I think that there are people who would claim that it's a great investment just because there aren't a lot of people around it, and there's not a lot of energy around the genre compared to a lot of other genres. So there's a lot more room to grow. Even if it grows by a little bit, that would be a huge leap for 1990s inserts. And I've always just thought that growing the market is a great thing. I mean, right now, I know that a lot of people are unhappy with the proliferation of flippers and personalities on YouTube who are sort of shucking and jiving and trying to help people buy stuff. And, some people would say that they're trying to pump up cards and move them later. That seems like too much trouble to me. It's more likely that they just enjoy it and they just enjoy watching the up and down cycles of cards and trying to sort of beat the system and game the system and maybe make a profit, either to spend on more cards because they love cards or for whatever reason. It doesn't really matter to me. So I want to ask that question to all of you, for all 6 of you, or, hi mom, hi dad, who are watching this. Weigh in. Let me know. What do you think? Do you think the 1990s insert landscape is one that investors should look into? Is there a lot of promise in a genre where there are so many cards that are worth so much money and that are printed in such low numbers? So with that, I'm going to wrap up my episode. I hope that this new format works. I would like to sort of be more personally connected with a lot of the people who view my videos. So I hope to be doing more camera-facing videos in the future. I have no real expertise or equipment set up, so I just have a iPhone pointed at me. I'm using the away camera because I know that it's higher res, but that means that I could have been talking for the last 35 minutes about this and it didn't record, or part of my head or face is cut off. So we'll just have to see. Anyways, thank you for staying with me as long as you have, if you made it to the end. And next week I will have another topic to ask you guys about because I would like to get your opinions. Okay, thanks a lot, guys.